It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the weekly podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch every Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. This week, Baron Victor Frankenstein, as portrayed by the great Peter Cushing, is back, and he's looking to get back at those who dare stand in his way of continuing his macabre experiments in The Revenge of Frankenstein. Now get this, The Curse of Frankenstein was the first Gothic monster movie released by Hammer Film Productions in 1957. It was followed up by the 1958 version of Dracula, which I talked about a couple of years ago. Now, that's kind of the reverse of how Universal did it by going Dracula first, then Frankenstein. But The Curse of Frankenstein was a massive hit, and only a few weeks after the release of Dracula, Hammer went right at the Mad Doctor himself with The Revenge of Frankenstein. Dracula wouldn't return for 8 years, which allowed Cushing's Frankenstein to appear in 3 more films. I don't really have anything else to say about that other than how I found that kind of interesting. But this is kind of par for the course, if you will, for Frankenstein. If we look at the Universal series, Frankenstein came out after Dracula, but both saw release in 1931. Bride of Frankenstein released in 1935. The only direct sequel that I can say Dracula really had was Dracula's Daughter in 1936. But the Count is nowhere to be found in that movie. The character of Dracula wouldn't actually be seen again until 1943's Son of Dracula, but he's played by Lon Chaney Jr. This was after Frankenstein and his monster appeared in 5 films. Now, Dracula is arguably the most popular movie character in the world. No horror character has appeared in more movies. In fact, the only fictional character to have appeared in more films was Sherlock Holmes. However, the 2 most famous studios to tackle the Prince of Darkness, Universal and Hammer, seemed more attached to Frankenstein. Part of this is likely due to rights. I believe Mary Shelley's Frankenstein book is in the public domain, whereas the Bram Stoker family has held onto the rights of their Dracula character considerably more tightly. Certainly, Dracula's influence is felt over many more vampire characters than anything else. It's hard to say that the Frankenstein monster enjoys that kind of status quite the same way. It's not like Frankenstein influences zombies all that much, really, when you get down to brass tacks. But enough about all that. You want to know more about The Revenge of Frankenstein. Alright, so here it goes. According to writer Jimmy Sangster, co-founder of Hammer Films James Carreras, pre-sold a sequel to The Curse of Frankenstein to America. And Sangster was like, whoa there, buddy. I killed Frankenstein at the end of the movie. And Sangster is correct. The first film ended with Baron Frankenstein going to the gallows for murder and generally being a bad dude. Carreras didn't really care. The deal was Sangster needed to find a way to undo that, and he'll think of something. But he only had 6 weeks to come up with a script. He somehow figured it out. The production began in January of 1958, just days after filming wrapped on Dracula, which also, of course, starred Cushing and was directed by Terence Fisher, who was returning to do this sequel. Now, making up the rest of the cast are your usual suspects when it comes to British character actors. Francis Matthews is here as Frankenstein's assistant. Matthews appeared in Dracula Prince of Darkness and Rasputin the Mad Monk, which were both Hammer films from 1966. Michael Gwynn is in this as well, and he appeared later in Village of the Damned and Scars of Dracula. And hey, we just saw him last week as the priest who our hero Simon has to turn away because he's pretty much lost his faith. The most interesting name in this cast is Eunice Gayson. She's a name that actually has a very significant place in film history, but is kind of lost to time and the passing of generations. You see, Ms. Gayson played a character by the name of Sylvia Trench in the first 2 James Bond movies, Dr. No and From Russia with Love. In fact, there are 3 things you can say about Sylvia Trench. The first is that she is the first Bond girl. Yes, Ursula Andress would steal the spotlight later on in Dr. No, but Gayson is the first woman seen being romanced by Sean Connery's James Bond. Second, she's the only Bond girl in the first 20 films. I exclude the Daniel Craig films for the specific reason that those 5 entries is kind of one whole arc. But she's the first to appear in multiple films. Other girls are referenced or discussed, but none are shown a second time, even by way of a recast. This is because Sylvia Trench is actually James Bond's girlfriend after they meet each other in Dr. No. And speaking of meeting each other, thirdly, Sylvia Trench introduced herself to James Bond in a very specific way. As they played Baccarat in the early moments of Dr. No, Bond, still off-screen, asks for her name, and she says, Trench, Sylvia Trench. When she asks him to introduce himself in return, Bond, in a cheeky act of mimicry, responds, Bond, James Bond, and he never stopped referring to himself that way for the next 24 films. So, with that, let's talk about this movie, The Revenge of Frankenstein. So, how does Baron Frankenstein get out of the death sentence? Well, the movie opens with a look at the gallows awaiting the Baron. Well, I should say the guillotine, because that's the method of execution in this town. The film explains that in 1860, Frankenstein was sentenced to death, and all of Europe was pretty excited about this. Frankenstein is led out by a priest and a man with a bit of a limp and a seemingly gimpy arm. And it turns out that guy in the guillotine's operator may be in on a plan because they kind of wink at each other. But the man with the limp is Carl, who's actually a hunchback. Now, after the blade comes crashing down, we cut to a pub, and 2 grave robbers are talking about committing, well, what they do, digging up graves. And they decide to dig up the fresh grave that was just had a body put in it from the prison. And they learn that this is the grave of Baron Frankenstein. They are the ones to discover that Frankenstein actually has escaped when the guillotine guy and Carl replaced Frankenstein with the priest, and it's the priest's body that is buried instead of the Baron's. One of the grave robbers dies of a heart attack when Frankenstein appears and introduces himself. 3 years pass, and Victor has changed his name to Dr. Stein. Now, I certainly hope he didn't change his first name to Frank. But anyway, he set up shop in Carlsbrook. And the panel of doctors in town are not too pleased about Dr. Stein coming and being a boss-ass doctor. They want him to join this council or essentially be banned from practicing medicine in Carlsbrook. Now, what makes Stein so successful is that he treats both the high class and the poor of the town. When the Council of Doctors approaches Stein, he explains that when he came to this little burg, he met an incredible amount of resistance from them when he attempted to set up a practice. And he realizes that the council only really exists to eliminate competition. So he worked hard to set up his own practice with no help and completely and totally on his own. So no thanks to the offer of joining this elitist club of doctors. Now, one of the younger doctors on the council, Hans Clave, recognizes Stein as Frankenstein, and Stein is cool under Clave's questioning. And he first plays it off as it being a common last name in Central Europe. He does eventually tell this younger man that he is the man that he thinks he is, and Clave wants to assist Frankenstein and learn from him. Now, Clave has the proper credentials to be useful to Victor, but Hans has to make sure that he keeps up with the whole Victor Stein and identity, but they can get to work together right away. Now, in Stein's laboratory, he shows Hans around, and he amputated an arm from one of the paupers, as well as other body parts that he's collected over time from working in the paupers' hospital. Also down there, Carl the Hunchback is keeping after the place and also cares for this chimpanzee that they have. Stein has a series of tanks with these body parts, and one is a pair of eyes that move around and look at a flame from the doctor's Bunsen burner. They also send a signal to a hand in another tank to move away from the fire as Stein puts it close to the glass. Victor shows Hans a whole body that he's built from pieces of people, and he's going to make good on a deal he made Carl by transplanting the hunchback's brain, a good brain that has learned a lot of good stuff from the doctor, into this new, more perfected body. Later, Margaret Conrad, played by Gayson, arrives at the Poor People Hospital, and she wants to work there. She's one of the minister's daughters when it comes to the ministry of these doctors on that council. So she's connected to that. And Hans hires her to work more or less as a gopher for the hospital. Carl comes in and seems to be taken by Margaret, and Margaret is very pleasantly kind to the hunchback. She even feels sorry for extending her right hand to introduce herself, not realizing that his is a bad hand, that he can't move. Now, Stein doesn't really want Margaret around. Being related to the guy who runs the council that dislikes Stein, he's afraid of losing his position at the hospital. But maybe he can have her wash one of the paupers. Maybe that will scare her off. But nevertheless, it's time to go to the lab and do the transplant that will put Carl's brain into that new body. Hans and Victor complete the transplant, and over the next several days, Hans and Victor work with Carl to get him acclimated to the new body, and he's beginning to have more control over his limbs and even able to start to speak. Later, one of the employees at the hospital who saw the two men bring Carl in lets Margaret into his room to see him, and Carl convinced Margaret to loosen the straps holding him down. And her, being a do-gooder, kind of realizes that he is very tightly strapped to the bed. And all of that was on purpose, was because, well, Carl shouldn't be moving around too much in his new body. But one of the bigger concerns that Hans learns is that the chimpanzee Otto, who has the brain of an orangutan, turned into a cannibal and ate his mate after his brain transplant. Hans is quite concerned about something like that happening to Carl. The success is turning out to be something maybe a little less exciting. However, Dr. Stein, he kind of blows this off. And on top of that, Victor has shown off that he has built yet another body to do another transplant. Now, unbeknownst to the two doctors, Carl has gotten free from his straps and climbed out a window to his freedom. That night, he sneaks into the lab and discovers his old body and incinerates it. When he's found by the drunken janitor, Carl has to defend himself and kills the man after the beating he gets triggers kind of a bloodthirst within him. Now, Victor and Hans discover that Carl has indeed escaped, and Victor is quite disappointed that Hans told Carl about how he's going to be a medical sensation. This is maybe what initially rattled Carl to the point that he needed to get out of there. And Margaret finds Carl hiding in the stable with her horses. He begs for her help and for her not to tell Dr. Stein. And instead of telling Victor, she decides to tell Hans about where she found Carl and the state that he was in. And before they can return to him, Carl discovers his body is starting to fail him. The same condition he had in his old body is now returning to his new body. What's more is he begins to stalk the town, and he attacks a young girl walking the streets by herself. While the police, Victor and Hans, continue their search for Carl, Victor goes to Margaret, and he asks her if his appearance was the same from when she saw him at the hospital. As they are about to leave this fancy dress party that the two men busted in on, Carl comes crashing in through the door and begs for help, calling Victor Frankenstein. Carl dies, but defiant, Victor continues to hold his ground, believing no one can really prove he's actually the Frankenstein they think he is. He even attends the council, and when he and Hans are questioned, he only claims to be a Frankenstein, but not the Frankenstein, changing his name because he knows that there were people who might have some negative correlation between the name and the acts from the first movie. But the council has the Baron Frankenstein grave dug up to find that, yep, he's not dead. Victor is mobbed by the paupers at the hospital and is mortally wounded, and this is from him basically being beaten to death. Hans performs a transplant on the body that Victor has in store at the lab, which happens to look a lot like Peter Cushing. Later, Victor, now going by Dr. Frank, is assisting Hans at a London practice. Alright, so let's get to my 3 things that I like about the Revenge of Frankenstein. First up, I love the first significant scene in which we see Cushing as Victor Stein. He's at his regular practice, and this uppity older lady comes in with her daughter and wants him to look her over. Both women seem, well, rather pampered. The older lady dotes over the younger woman, and the younger woman is supposedly weak and unable to move very long before she must rest. He has her go down to basically her knickers or whatever the underwear would be under those big fluffy dresses of the time, and he uses a classic stethoscope to listen to her heart and her breathing. And of course, the younger woman wants him to just press his ear up to her boobs. And Victor is not exactly wanting to do that. And when he puts that stethoscope on her chest, she complains about it being cold. And the mother just wants him to press his face right up to the younger woman's boobs. It's such a small thing, but it's really kind of funny because I think the older woman is trying to pawn her daughter off to marry Victor as a important doctor of this town, but it also sets up Victor as a less cold person than we saw in the first film, but also keeps him sort of at arm's length too. It also has a little bit of comedy and levity to the scene where he seems to almost be put upon caring for these richer people in comparison to how he treats the poor at the paupers hospital. It's really some pretty good characterization to almost draw us back onto Frankenstein's side. And Peter Cushing just plays it expertly. Now, second, we have Stein's lab, which is really, really cool. Sure, there's a lot of colored chemicals, spinny things and stuff that sparks, and you have like the spiral glass that things kind of travel into a big beaker or whatever. But the whole series of tanks with the different body parts is really kind of cool and probably kind of gruesome for its era. Stein talks about how the nerves are the important thing when he's resurrecting somebody. They have to send signals from one part to the next. The eyes see the flame and it tells the hand to not touch it. It's cool how they create the effects with little to no indication how they make the eyes or the arm move. It's just a cool old movie thing, seeing the eyes like that, disembodied. How does it work in the real world application? Don't worry about it. Just look at the freaking eyes in the fish tank, and that's all you really need. Thirdly, I like that the transplant of Carl's brain into his new body didn't immediately create a monster. It's a gradual degradation. He's mostly frail of mind after the transplant, but when he's beaten up by the lab's drunken janitor, he suddenly begins to fly into a murderous rage. He even starts to get the urge to eat the dead man's flesh. There's a bit more of a tragic story with this monster. Carl may have helped kill a priest at the beginning of the movie, but he helps Frankenstein to hopefully get a new body that isn't broken and twisted. Carl is kind of a nice guy, really, and has fallen in love with Margaret. So all this kind of shatters the poor guy, and he devolves into a monster instead of being born one. While Victor himself is much more brutal and conniving in the original, this movie has that softer side where Victor is a little kinder and a little more successful and kind of a gentler villain. The creature he creates is hardly a monster, just an unfortunate man. Now, one more note that I have for this movie. In this film, I mentioned that a girl was walking home alone and is attacked by Carl, right? Well, she was walking home frustrated that the boy who either she is courting or he was courting her, whatever it was more interested in studying ants on the ground than studying her on their date. That boy is played by Ian Whittaker. He would later go on to become a highly sought-after set decorator. He was nominated 4 times for Oscars for Aliens, The Remains of the Day, and Anna and the King, and he won the Oscar for Best Art Direction Set Decoration for Howard's End. So, how's about that? that ends this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. And don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers, as well as YouTube. You can also check out my website, bmovieanima.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next time, we continue our Hammer Horror Month with 1964's The Gorgon, which stars both Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. So until next week, stay spooky.